Welcome to the NPX Innovation Chatalyst podcast, the podcast where we talk to innovative leaders in the nuclear industry and beyond. I'm your host, Margaret Macbeth, co-founder and innovation catalyst at NPX. Today we're speaking with Frishta Bastan, who is a diversity and inclusion professional, spoken word artist, community organizer, author activist, and religious coffee drinker. She started writing poetry to help navigate her hyphenated, layered Afghan-Canadian identity, including engaging in dialogue surrounding social justice issues at home and abroad. Frishta has performed for over 8 years in front of diverse audiences around the world, most recently at the UN Torino Forum for Sustaining Peace. She's been working directly with marginalized and underrepresented communities and their empowerment for nearly 10 years. And to top it off, she holds a master's in international relations with a heavy focus on intersectional feminism. Welcome so much to the podcast, Frishta.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for having me.
It's really great to talk to you. Before we dig into the topic for today, I just have to ask you about this spoken word art that you do. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into that and about what that is?
I kind of started spoken word poetry about nearly 10 years ago. It was, to be completely honest with you, it was out of complete anger. I was really frustrated with the fact that what was represented in the media about what Afghanistan was, who Afghans were a very negative representation. And I was getting frustrated that the only association that the land had was to war and pain and trauma. So I started writing to kind of raise awareness about the situation of Afghanistan, but also to shed light about the diversity and the beauty of the country and the people and the history. And I was kind of tired of having other people speak on our behalf. So I started writing to kind of build a channel of these emotions and frustrations, but also to use it as a tool of education to further raise awareness and give a different perspective about the country.
It sort of brings to mind this idea that in Canada, we really pride ourselves on being a multicultural country, but often we don't know very much about the cultures and the people that make up the fabric of our country, including the Indigenous people in our country. Yeah. And that sort of is a nice segue to the topic for today. We wanted to talk about systemic racism, what it means to be anti-racist, and what that means for us as individuals, for us in communities, and for us that are part of the nuclear industry, what that means and what it is that we can do to educate ourselves and to make an impact. Once again, we saw this past summer, the spotlight really shining on the impact of systemic racism. Certainly we saw that with events like the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other, sort of very high-profile episodes that were coming out of the U.S. We've certainly seen it in Canada too. So wanted to invite you into, because this is something that you're not only, I think, you obviously have some lived experience with, but something that you do day to day, working with individuals and communities. So just to start us off, kind of wanted to do a bit of anti-racism 101, because there's a lot of terms being thrown out, and we don't always know what these mean or are comfortable with how we can sort of wrap our heads around them and start to integrate them. I wanted to talk a bit about what it means to be anti-racist and why we use that expression.
Angela Davis says, it's not enough to be not racist, you have to be anti-racist. And that kind of basically means, although most of us don't really intentionally want to harm people or discriminate against people, but sometimes based on our biases, our learnings in society, our upbringings, where we've lived and the communities that we've kind of grew up, that depicts and determines how we perceive the world and other people who look different than us. Being anti-racist basically means that you are actively working towards building a racist-free world. You're using your position of power and privilege to ensure that you're doing your part to uplift and listen to marginalized and underrepresented communities and voices. And that work doesn't really stop or start anywhere. It's an ongoing process. It's a lifetime commitment, and it's something that you are constantly unlearning and learning about. So I always say that, like, being anti-racist means you're committed to the work, and being non-racist just means that you're giving yourself a pat on the back and saying, well, I don't discriminate, so I don't need to do any of the work.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction. And often when we hear the word racism or racist, people are very quick to just want to disassociate themselves from that word and say, I'm not racist, or I don't hold racist beliefs, therefore I'm not part of the problem. But I'm sure this is something that you hear. How do you respond to that when people say, well, I love everyone, I'm not a racist, like how do I, what part do I need to play in problem solving here?
Right. So I'll bring it back to myself. I'm an Afghan Muslim Canadian woman, but my identity, my visible identity, is pretty ambiguous sometimes, and I could come off as white passing. I do benefit from the privileges of my skin color to give me benefits that a black Muslim might not have, or a hijabi Muslim might not have. So that automatically gives me different privileges than they do, even though we might share the same religious identity. So that's kind of difference between acknowledging the privilege that I have, even though I do come from a underrepresented, racialized, marginalized community. I still hold privileges based on the way I look, based on my name, or the way I can speak the language. Those give me the privileges immediately and automatically that my other community members might not have. So it's not enough for me to say, well, I'm Afghan, so I can't be racist because I go through these experiences. No, because I might have internalized biases or stereotypes of other communities that I have not addressed yet at an internal level. So when we talk about, folks trying to disassociate from the word racism entirely, and they're trying to, not try to do whatever they can to show that they're not racist. The work, comes from internally, and it's like, okay, it's great that you love your neighbors and you treat everyone the same, but you as a person might have privileges and powers that the underrepresented groups who are continuously targeted by racism don't have. So by not doing anything, you're still upholding the structures of institutionalized racism. So it's not enough to be not doing anything, because if you don't do anything, then you're not stopping the problem either. So that's the distinction is, of course, no one wants to be targeted as racist, and no one wants to be associated with being a racist, of course, but it's the work that comes in there. It's just acknowledging the fact that you might have privileges and powers that a person who might not look like you doesn't have.
I just really agree with you. It's important that we're all, really reflecting and having these difficult conversations. And it can be difficult self-reflection, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people don't. There's fear. They're scared to say the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. They're scared to, make a mistake or admit a shortcoming, and that can be, kind of a barrier to this. I think another potential barrier in the workplace is, most workplaces will have like a diversity and inclusion program.
Yeah.
And I'll as a white woman who's been in the nuclear industry for a long time, often I'm a person who's leading those initiatives, which I think is potentially questionable. But wanted to, kind of dig in a little bit, like, how is diversity and inclusion different from addressing racism? And, what are maybe some of the ways that by having diversity and inclusion, either initiatives or, people who are in charge of those initiatives in organizations, what are some of the barriers that you see?
sometimes folks get a little confused by tackling anti-racism with just having more people of color on board, or having more people of color, BIPOC community members, on your team. And that's great. I mean, that's definitely a step to have more representation, have more folks of diversity on your team, on your senior staff, on your frontline staff. However, it still doesn't address the systemic racism that might exist in the institution as a whole. In your HR practices, versus with how you hire and where you hire from, to who gets promoted into the leadership positions, and what is the kind of work that people of color are being brought on to do. Sometimes we see that coordinator positions or the lower positions are usually done by people of color, but the higher senior positions you'll see is usually done by white people. So it's not enough to pat yourself on the back and say, look, we have more diversity on our team because we've hired X amount of Black people or X amount of Indigenous people. It's great. It's definitely a start, but then you're not addressing the systemic barriers that might exist. Do your employees feel safe enough to go to your HR and talk about their experiences in your company? Are there microaggressions that exist? Are there macroaggressions that exist? Are you do your BIPOC employees feel safe enough to come talk to you when an incident has happened in the workplace? These are the kind of questions that answer to the culture of the company and the encouragement of the company when it comes to ensuring that you have a safe, inclusive, anti-racist space. So that's the kind of where the distinction is kind of made. Is although actually most recently with the Black Lives Matter protests kind of picking up this year. I mean, it's been around since like 2016. This year, although it's been projected on a different level, and it's kind of gained more, I guess, I don't want to say exposure or attention, but it's brought a lot more people paying attention this time around, I think. And that has encouraged a lot of companies to start hiring DEI roles. And it's great. I've seen a lot of like DEI manager roles, DEI specialist roles, but you'll see that it's only one person doing this job. And this job is not a simple job. It's not an easy job. It's not a one-person job. As a matter of fact, it is a company commitment that has to go into ensuring that your practices and your policies abide by anti-racism standards.
It's such a good point. We often, it's a bit of tokenism, right? We have a position, we filled the role, therefore we've checked that box. But it really has to permeate the entire organization and how we go about doing work. Mm-hmm. You brought up the Black Lives Matter protest, and we certainly we saw these protests happening and still happening in the U.S. There were some in Canada, mm-hmm. But one thing that I do hear is people say, this is a U.S. problem. Mm-hmm. In Canada, we don't have these sorts of issues. We don't have this sort of level of whether it's police brutality or systemic racism or just racism in our culture. Mm-hmm. So wanted to get your sort of feedback on that. What are some of the impacts of systemic racism in Canadian society, and how do you see that in your work?
So one of the things we have to acknowledge is who is saying that we don't have as bad as racism we do in Canada and in the States. It's always important to acknowledge where the narrative is coming from, because obviously if it's not affecting you, you're not going to see it. If it's not in your social sphere, you're not going to see it. And that can come from your social location, that can come from the privilege that you have, that can very much come from your skin color, the ethnic background that you carry, all of these, your social security, all of this comes to whether or not are you on a regular day-to-day basis going to actually interact with law enforcement? Are you going to interact with systemic barriers? So these are the kind of things we have to keep in mind when approaching these kind of this topic in comparing Canadian issues versus American issues. It's interesting because we most recently started to do land acknowledgements, for example, at a lot of events, and companies started doing that before meetings, which is great. But by acknowledging the land, you also are acknowledging that we are settlers on this land, and we come from a history of colonization and continue to come from colonization. That in itself should be proof to us that we still live in a very in a racist system. Very, very much because Indigenous communities still don't have access to clean drinking water. So just keeping these things in mind, and regardless of that, I mean, we shouldn't be proud that we have lesser racism. We should be finding pride that we have no racism. That's the kind of country and society and community that we want to build towards and work towards, is an absolute and not a racist country at all. So with that in mind, though, if we bring it a little bit closer to home and we address these concerns, there's been so many studies done of how people with ethnic names have a hard time getting a job, for example. People with Muslim names have a hard time getting a job. If these things are not an indication of the kind of society that we live in, then we really need to start unpacking how we perceive the country based on the social bubble that we're in. Because my lived experience is very different than your lived experiences, right? My lived experience as an Afghan Muslim is very different because I have a history and background of growing up around the 9/11 era. Whereas you might not have the same experience, right?
Yeah.
So, with that being said, if I, were to apply with a very Muslim name, I will have a harder time getting a job versus someone who might not have a very visible Muslim name. I mean, if we're talking about discrimination with the law enforcement, just this year in August, the Ontario Human Rights Commission inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black persons by the Toronto Police Service confirms that Black people are more likely than others to be arrested, charged, overcharged, struck, shot, or killed by the Toronto Police.
It kind of feels like we've been revisiting this narrative, many times, particularly over the last few years, especially. So. I guess just wanted to unpack a little bit, what do you think is different about this time, this point in time and the response that we're seeing, and how can we, harness that momentum? Is that momentum waning, or can we actually continue to push change forward?
Yeah. So. Like I said earlier, the Black Lives Matter movement has been going on since early 2016, during the Ferguson protests, during the protests of Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, and I remember back then the topic of Black Lives Matter and the protests was a little quote unquote controversial for people to talk about. I remember it was a very within activist circles, within social community organizing circles, that the movement was kind of adopted and taken on for and supported by. What the difference I saw this time around was, I mean, it could be for a lot of things. It's definitely this time I've seen a little bit more pickup and in support by people who are usually not involved in social justice circles. For once, being corporations who are expressing their solidarity with their Black community members and the movement. And I think it has to do with a lot of things. I think it's always been very blatant. If you're paying attention. But now I feel like with the social, political environment that we're in right now, You can no longer ignore it. You can no longer pretend like it doesn't exist. You can no longer brush it aside. It's very loud. It's very prominent. It's everyone is basically, talking about it, and it's gaining this kind of attraction where I think it's pressuring a lot of people, a lot of organizations to say something and to address it, and to have some sort of response to it. Whereas before, I don't think that kind of pressure was on, at least from regular, ordinary people, to go back to companies who are not from the Black community and say, hey, what's your response to this? This is going on. How are you going to respond to this? Whereas now I think that pressure actually exists, and that pressure is coming from allies and stronger allies. And I think that's kind of the difference right now, and companies are feeling that they now have a responsibility to address these kind of concerns, and in order to protect and to show their support for their own employees. It's no longer what it was, referred to as before, just a political, movement. It's a social justice. It's a equitable, inclusive movement. It's a human rights movement, and I think that's the difference now. Our understanding of it is different. It's better. It's stronger. And that comes from, of course, the work of our Black community members and their allies who've been pushing this kind of narrative forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point and a way to look at it. Now it's not enough to companies have to address it specifically and are really being challenged to show not just solidarity, but action.
Yeah.
I think what else is kind of neat about some of what we saw after, during the protests were people really speaking out and speaking out. It was almost like the Me Too movement, where you had people say, I'm working in this company and there's clearly racism here, or I'm being paid less than my white colleagues.
Yeah.
And that was, we saw a number of sort of high profile CEOs step down. And I thought, that's a really important piece too. It's not just, companies pledging solidarity or saying, we support Black Lives Matter, we believe Black Lives Matter, but also, people who are part of those organizations calling out what is really going on.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good point, is that, it's hard because, unfortunately, in a lot of workspaces, people of color tend not to bring these issues up because they're worried about being labeled as too political or too controversial or always talking about issues, and and honestly, potentially jeopardizing any kind of potential for promotion or for moving up, or just to be accepted in your workspace. It's harder. We have more to lose, to be honest. We have more at stake than, for example, our white allies to speak up about these issues and to address these issues. And it's not to say that we need you to speak for us or on behalf of us. It's just, it's to address that we've been talking about this for so many years. Black Lives Matter has been a movement for so many years, and it's beyond just what we know as a movement now. Our Black community members, our Indigenous community members have been talking about this for decades, exhaustingly talking about this for decades, about the inequalities that they face, the discrimination that they face. And it's not up to us to kind of be like, I'm going to speak for you or on your behalf. I have listened, I have heard, I have learned. Now I'm going to use my position of privilege and power to address these concerns how I can, with the insight and the teachings of marginalized, underrepresented communities. So I think that's kind of like, it's I think we see that kind of change now, and honestly it's hopeful, and beyond even just companies, I think individuals themselves are kind of tackling this issue at a family level. You know, I saw a lot of posts that people saying like, look, I've had very difficult conversations with my racist parents or my racist uncles or aunts and cousins, and that's kind of where it starts from, right? Where it's no longer just I'm going to post on social media about my support and solidarity. It's, you know what, I'm going to take this as an individual responsibility and talk to the people closest to me.
Yeah, to your point, it's beyond just showcasing your own solidarity and actually having those hard conversations, whether it's with your family, your friends, your employer. And I so take your point. There's much more on the line for people of color, racialized people, to have to speak out about their experience, particularly in the workplace. And the onus is on all of us, and probably particularly white people more, to be pushing this conversation forward and bringing it to light and calling ourselves out in our workplaces. And sometimes, you know, we're not going to see real change happen unless we all get political to some level. And there is, I see reluctance there. You know, I've heard people say to me, well, I want to be anti-racist and I believe Black Lives Matter, but I'm uncomfortable with what I see in the protests. You know, I don't support violence in protests, or I don't support calls to defund the police. So just like, how can we think about that, and how can we engage with some of those ideas and start to understand what's driving them, right?
Yeah, so let's dive into this one by one. So let's first talk about the quote-unquote violent protests. So when we define violence, that comes from our own understanding of what we think of what violence is. We define it based on what we've been taught, what we learn, our own experiences. We have to acknowledge that oppression is a very violent thing. Systemic oppression is a very violent thing. Discrimination is very violent. Racism is very violent. Disproportionately being targeted based on your skin color, your religion, is violence. This causes harm to people. This causes pain to people. So if we're talking about wanting people to respond to violence with wanting to be calm and collected, it really forces us to reflect how we perceive as violence then, you know? And what are we going to pick and choose to define as violent? And honestly, one thing that we need to keep in mind is it is not up to us to determine and to say how folks who are directly being impacted by this violent structure of oppression, how they should respond. This is decades and decades and decades of oppression. This is decades and decades and decades of harm and pain that has been caused to these communities. We really need to take a step back and to reflect, you know, who am I to decide how people should respond when they have been basically, you know, silenced and repressed for so many years.
And I mean, legitimately, their lives are on the line.
Literally.
We are watching day after day, it feels like, video footage of people of color being killed by by police officers who should be there to protect us. I mean, I know for myself, I don't have a fear that an interaction with a law enforcement officer could end in my death, but that is clearly a very real fear, and and reality for many people in our society.
I mean, and it's interesting because, of course, fine, let's condemn all forms of violence, sure. But then I want to see that same type of energy and that same type of bold stance to say you're going to say the same thing about police brutality. Then I want that same kind of response and energy and say, look, fine, I don't agree with violent protests, but I also am going to take a very bold stance, like I am with the protest, against police brutality and against any kind of violence shown by law enforcement officers. So that's sometimes, the disconnect that I see is folks will always be quick to jump and say, well, they're being so violent with their protests and their demands, and there are different ways of doing this, but then don't even acknowledge at all the very real violence that is caused by the law enforcement, or systems of oppression. So that's kind of something also to reflect on is, okay, if you're going to say this, then I want you to also recognize all types of violence.
I think too, we forget that, if you look back at the civil rights movement, it wasn't all peaceful protests. Many of those protesters were putting their lives on the line, and we were seeing very similar, police forces and people being violent towards people who were pushing for civil rights. Mm-hmm. We see it in Canada when Indigenous people are standing up for their land or for the environment. Often that results sometimes in clashes with the military.
Exactly.
It's not, this. I think we do have to acknowledge that making change happen, mm-hmm. And really putting ourselves on the line for human rights mm-hmm. Can sometimes be quote unquote violent.
Exactly. So with that being said, I think your second part of the question was.
So around sort of, how can we think about some of the political demands that come from organizations like Black Lives Matter? How can we, because it can be very alarming for people to hear things like defund or abolish the police, mm-hmm. That can be very unsettling. Right. But how can we understand where these demands are coming from and how to think about these points of view?
So I want to clear up a misconception when it comes to the statement defund the police. When we say defund the police, we don't mean let's disarm every single police officer right now and tomorrow we're going to take up the responsibility to protect each other and take in that role and bring in just social workers to deal with any kind of criminal offense. No, defunding is a long process. It's a long-term goal to ensure that the resources and the budget that is being allocated to law enforcement is being managed properly and being used to address the problems that exist within the law enforcement. So when we talk about defunding the police, it's not to say that we are going to take away all their money all at once, and then that's it, and we're not going to address any other systemic issue, we're not going to address any other issues that exist in society that might, have caused alterations with the law enforcement. Right now, the way the system works currently, the number of interactions with BIPOC communities are disproportionately higher with law enforcement than any other group. Although Black folks only represent 8.8% of Toronto's population, they are 32% of all charges in the charge data set, while white people and other racialized groups are underrepresented. Without keeping that also in mind, Black and Brown Indigenous bodies are higher at being stopped or being questioned than any other race. So this is with the current budgets, right? And this has been going on for the last little while. Right now, Peel's budget is about, I believe, 60% of their taxpayer budget 40% of taxpayer dollars in PO goes towards police.
Wow.
So keeping that in mind, in the last 6 months, we saw a elderly man in Moulton that had a mental health crisis that was shot and killed by the police.
Yeah.
Now, if a law enforcement has this large of a budget and is still having having interactions with folks with mental health illnesses and then dying at the scene, there has to be something we are doing gravely wrong. In Toronto, more than 25% of taxpayer dollars are going to police services. So that's $1,127,000,000 of taxpayer funds that go into police services, the police board, and parking authorities. Only less than $800 million actually goes to TTC, and less than 2% of the city's budget is allocated to health. That's only $69 million.
Wow.
So these are numbers, okay? Let's just put aside any emotional, political, or personal attachments to the movement. Given this data, and given the fact that every year we increase budgets, we invest more money into police and law enforcement, and yet the number of deaths are not going down. We're not talking about steady. We don't want it to be steady. We need a complete elimination of police brutality, or police violence, or police-caused death. If at this point, with the amount of money and a budget that's going into the police, we're still facing these challenges, that means the way we're doing things right now is not working. We have to come up with better ways and better solutions to address it. Like any other problem, the more you keep hitting something and it's not working, you don't keep hitting it. You come with different ways of approaching it.
Thanks for listening to the NPX Innovation Chatalyst podcast. To hear the full podcast and to subscribe, you can go to Apple Podcasts, Google, or wherever podcasts are available.